So it's official. Media and influencers have gotten to play Space Marine 2, and we all have a lot of thoughts on it. Now, I have gotten to play a lot of it. We got access to a story mission, which was probably about 45 minutes long, and then we got access to pretty much unfettered access to the multiplayer co-op stuff, albeit only 2 missions there, but we could play as much of it as we wanted to. Really, really solid. I think graphically the game is really impressive, except for skin and faces when helmets come off during the story missions. There are some cutscenes and stuff that play out with that, and honestly, it just, everybody's skin looks really, really flat and just not very realistic. But other than that, I think it's really, really impressive across the board. And knowing it's coming from a team that has had sort of a mixed track record, it's encouraging to see them do so well here. As for the actual gameplay itself, it's really, really punchy. It's really gory and intense. I think some builds are certainly more, I would say, viable than others. Some classes, like the sniper class, downright terrible, just not practical, doesn't make any sense to use. They're just not very good. So like there's that. As for little like Easter eggs, I don't even know if you call this an Easter egg, but there's little bitty stuff that if you know Warhammer lore, you're going to eat up, like, you know, the executions of the traitors and stuff. Destructible environments, the particle effects, smoke effects all look great. The game runs really, really well. I, to be fair, am running on a very high-end PC, so maybe it's not as scalable on lower end hardware, but what I played ran really well and was really polished. The only problems I had were small things like audio issues where maybe the audio sounds really muffled and then a reboot fixes it, or toggling helmets off and on wouldn't work consistently. You toggle it off and then you couldn't put it back on until you restarted the game. Small stuff, but like not enough to ruin the game, but I'm sure that stuff can be fixed in the next month, I would guess. As for gameplay, my main concern with Space Marine 2, since it's been announced basically, has been whether or not they are able to increase enemy variety. Because in all the gameplay they've shared so far, it's been just waves and waves of Tyranids, and that's about it, just swarms and swarms. But what I am happy to report is that there are actually a lot. I mean, there's a good variety of enemies, even just in the one story mission we played. And we were told that took place about halfway through the campaign. I don't know how long the campaign is. I don't know if it's like an 8-hour campaign or if it's a 4-hour campaign or 2 hours. I really don't know. But they said that it was about halfway through, and just in that one mission, we saw a pretty solid variety of mini boss fights and brutes and fighting waves of enemies, which was really, really cool to see. In addition, I mean, just the scope of the game is ridiculous. You can see anytime you're fighting, like right here, watch in the background, there are just waves of Tyranids running off and going down these ravines and explosions and just massive buildings in the distance. And that's always present. I mean, there's some levels which of course are smaller in scope and more narrow, but then there's also levels like this, which you'll be fighting something like the Carnifex. And then in the background, there's just ridiculous numbers of things happening. So to see that the game runs really steadily even then is really, really promising, because that's not easy to do. It's funnily enough, when I was playing it and I saw like all of these little guys running off in the distance, let me see if I can find another shot of it. I was reminded of that one moment in the Gollum game. You remember where like, I'm guessing you probably didn't play it, but you know, in all the coverage and videos and reviews and stuff, where we pointed to it, where you stood on this ledge and you look down and then you just see these like sprites running not in the right direction, moving slowly across the frame. It just looked horrible and was really, really bad. They're doing a similar thing here, but this is when it looks really good. You know, this is how it's supposed to be done, unlike Gollum, which did not do it that way. In terms of the gameplay itself, they encourage hyper aggression. You'll notice when you take damage, there's a little white section of the health bar in the top left. That's actually very similar to the rally system in Bloodborne. So the goal is to then rush up and do a finisher like you see here, and that will refill that red bar. It'll also refill a shield gauge, which is exactly what it sounds like, a shield, and helps you just take more damage and hits without it affecting your actual health. So the game very much encourages close range combat, hyper aggressive combat, and that's when the game feels the most fun, which again is why the sniper class, for example, just doesn't make sense and feels so bad, because it's like the core of the gameplay loop is get up close personal and be hyper aggressive. And then the sniper class is a class dedicated to doing the opposite. So it just doesn't really blend that well. But as for how it works for like Warhammer fans, again, Thousand Suns right there, some Rubric Marines with flamers and stuff, and Zangors. The game for Warhammer fans is a love letter. You're going to eat it up. If you're not familiar with Warhammer, I think this could be a great introduction to it and could be really, really cool. And then as for this, like this is one of those encounters that is just really, really unique. And we previously have not seen anything about it. I mean, you're impaling a Thousand Suns Rubric Marine. And it's a good touch that their armor just kind of falls apart because Thousand Suns are like ancient and made of dust, sort of. It's complicated, but it's a good touch that the armor just kind of falls apart after. They don't like fall together as one body. It's a good touch. But it's just really, really well done from a Warhammer fan perspective, and then also from just a hack and slash style game. It's just really well done. So I had a really good time. I'm very excited to see what the final game brings to the table. The only potential hiccup I could see coming is that the story may be really, really short. That's kind of what my gut's telling me, is that it's going to be like a 5 to 6 hour campaign, and then we're going to just move into multiplayer stuff. It's not the end of the world, but the game is $60. So I hope that there is a good bit of content here. But even if it were just the multiplayer mode has a lot in it. And if anything, the legs on it are just as long as like Darktide was, if not longer, at launch. So I think it's got a lot of potential. And it's just good to see that they gave this game the time it needed. Because again, remember, it was supposed to launch like a year ago. So the fact that they've given it all this time is really encouraging. Really, really encouraging. Luke, that was a very Slaneshi way of putting it. Thank you. Yes, Thousand Suns and their silly hats. Yeah. Is there co-op? Yep, there's co-op through the campaign. So if you want to play with your buddies, you can do that. There's also, of course, co-op in the multiplayer. And then there's also a mode that we weren't able to try, which is a big PvP mode, which also seems like it has a lot of potential, where basically you're going to go with teams of 3, like 3v3 or 4v4 or whatever they're going to do. And you just fight waves of each other. And it just seems like an interesting way of doing it. So it's a very 360 era game, which is not a bad thing. It feels like a game you would have played as a kid, again, in a good way, where it's just not trying to be for modern audiences. I saw one guy giving, I think Force Gaming is who it was, crap because he said he liked the game, and somebody replied to him. It was like, what, you like this woke garbage? It's like, guys, if we're at the point where we're calling Space Marine woke garbage, I don't think the term woke means anything anymore. And the only reason they're saying that is because Games Workshop retconned some of the lore and made it so Custodes had women in their faction, basically. And they're like, no, they were always here. You just didn't know about them. So yeah, it's always been here, but if you didn't know about them, that's your fault for being sexist. Yeah, and it was a bad look to basically call their own audience sexist and creeps for not just going along with it, for rewriting a bunch of the lore. But to then conclude that the entire franchise is therefore woke garbage is pretty cringy. You know, like, it's one thing that they did and they got a crap ton of blowback for it. If they get to the point where they're like, yeah, and then Thousand Suns, turns out they're all lesbians, then, you know, it'll be like, okay, well, we're just rewriting stuff now, like in real time. And then maybe you could make a clear argument, but I don't know how you could say that just because they did one thing with Custodes and a codex, therefore the entire franchise is garbage. Like, it's a bit of a leap, personally. But they are doing a lot to try and push Warhammer into the mainstream. They're doing this. They also have a show with Amazon Prime with Henry Cavill in the works, and that looks like it's got a lot of potential. So there's just a lot of stuff going on with Warhammer, and they're trying to make it more mainstream. And I hope they're successful because the franchise is really cool. The IP is really cool. The lore is insane, so long as they don't keep rewriting it for no reason. And I think people are going to eat it up the more that they check it out. Yeah, you said it was a good point to jump in, but if you don't know anything about the series, wouldn't you be lost as to what is happening? Well, the thing is, Wander, I don't think there's a fix for knowing everything going on when you jump into a new IP. Like, if you've never played Fallout, you've never seen Fallout, you have no idea what Fallout is or is about or anything. Playing any of the games will have you start not knowing what's going on with a lot of the other stuff that's referenced, but you'll learn about it. You'll start to figure it out as you play. I think it just at the end of the day, you got to start somewhere, right? Like my wife had never experienced anything with Fallout. She watched the Fallout show and was like, oh, actually, I really like this. And it was a good starting point. For her, she didn't get all the little bitty gags with, seeing jet as a drug in the game, or all of the little tidbits where they're drinking Nuka-Cola or anything. She didn't get any of those references because she doesn't know anything about the franchise, but it was a good way for her to start. So I think at the end of the day, you just got to start. We're not talking about going and reading an intense book of Warhammer 40K lore to begin with. We're just saying, yeah, play a game that's meant for broad audiences. And if you enjoy it, then maybe start to dig deeper into the lore and why some of these things work the way they do. And, you might be able to get hooked on it, So anyway, having said that, I really think Space Marine 2 is shaping up to be a real love letter to Warhammer fans. I think it needs some balancing personally, because as of right now, I think it's just a little too fast and loose with how some of these things are balanced. Some of the guns are just bad. Others are really good. But I'm sure once the game launches, they'll be able to do a lot more balancing in real time. It's just going to be a matter of getting the players in to test it. But hopefully this feedback from these events are helpful and will help them do that. But I think it's shaping up to be something really good. And again, I'm just so thankful that the publisher and Focus Entertainment and Saber, the devs, they've given it enough time and energy to really be its best self, which is just so refreshing. Because if this game launched a year ago, I'm sure it would have had a lot of performance issues. It would have had all sorts of issues. And so to give them an extra year to just really make sure it's awesome and is exactly what people want, it's just so refreshing. And I think they're going to be rewarded for it, honestly. And hopefully that signals to other devs, give your games time to cook, release them when they're ready, and people will like it. It's really not that hard to understand, It's not that hard. He took my thing. Red flag, red